Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a short disclaimer. It is okay for you to laugh during any point of this presentation. You'll understand why soon. So, I'm going to give you a story about compassion, and also about the limits of compassion. And compassion in the face of extreme confusion. And because of that, it's not as streamlined as many stories as you might usually hear, but neither is the story that it takes so much of its inspiration from the Bible. But enough of a prelude. I'll let you hear for yourselves. When I was 16, my father became a missionary Baptist preacher. On that day, my mother and I were in church, and it was sort of expected because we'd gone to church 3 times a week, every week since the moment that I could actually go to church. And so for my father, this was a very natural step. But there was something that my mother and I were not expecting, which was the sight of him walking up the aisle and crying and shaking and asking between his sobs for God to forgive him of all of his sins and so that he could become a full-time preacher. And as my mom and I had to stand up on the stage beside him and receive all these hugs from all of these really nice people that were crying, we both knew something that nobody else knew, which was that I was gay. Yeah, it's okay, you can laugh. So, it gets weirder, just wait. So I don't know if you know much about the Missionary Baptist Church, but it is a fundamentalist church that believes in the literal truth of the Bible. In other words, Adam and Eve were very real. They lived in a garden. Eve talked to a snake. Eve ate the apple. Eve gave the apple to Adam, and Adam got the rotten deal. And that also means that Noah built an ark with his own 2 hands, that he somewhat single-handedly saved all of humanity and all of the animal kingdom from extinction. However, a lot of people died, but that's beside the point. Thus saving humanity from 40 days and 40 nights of a tidal wave. So that means that in Leviticus, when it says, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind," that means thou shalt not lie with mankind. Very literally. And so you can imagine the kinds of complications that this brought on. But luckily, the process of becoming a fully ordained preacher takes quite a long time. So my mother and I, in our scheming, decided, okay, how are we going to tell him? We've got to wait a long time until it's the exact right moment. And it turns out there's actually not a right moment for this sort of thing. And so one night, when we couldn't handle it anymore, we just told him. We were like, okay, Garrard thinks he might be gay. That was what my mom said. Very direct. And so in that moment, my father stood up from his recliner, and he took me into the bedroom, closed the door, said, "Sit down." And I was like, oh God, what is going to happen? And that was literally, oh God, because I was praying at that moment. And so at this moment, my father said these words that I don't think I will ever be able to erase from my brain, which were, if I was ever going to be straight, he just ruined the chances. Because he said, "You just don't know what it feels like to be inside a woman." Yeah. And I don't. Truthfully. Truth-telling, it's memoir. So in that moment, I was just like, I can't do this. And I said to my dad, I was like, I really don't think there's ever going to be a moment. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I really don't think so. And so he said, okay, let's go see the pastor. Because my father was not a fully ordained pastor, we still had to rely on our own, and our own church family. And so we went to see the pastor, and he sat us down in his office, and we explained the whole thing, and he said, "Hey, you're lucky because this is not the first case of homosexuality in the church, if you can believe that." And he slid a brochure across the table, and the brochure said, "Love in Action." I'm not making any of this up. I have the documents to prove it. It said "Love in Action," and it had all of these really smiling, happy people on the front of it. And when we started to flip through it, it had words that said things like, "Since coming to Love in Action, I've learned that I can now be with my family sin-free. And since coming to Love in Action, I can now have the dream of a real straight family." And all these people looked 100% straight. I don't know how to explain to you what 100% straight looks like, but their smiles were a little less gay. Yep. And it turns out the process was pretty streamlined. By this time, in the early 2000s, in Arkansas, in the Bible Belt, there were many such camps available. And there were actually 250 at the time. So what I would do is I would submit an application, and from that point on, I would wait for a phone call, and if they accepted me, I would go be cured, okay? And on that application, I thought it was a little strange that it asked me things like, "What forms of idolatry have you practiced?" And underneath that list, it said, Dungeons and Dragons, video games, pornography, masturbation, impure thoughts. And so, I checked off a few of those. And so, okay, we're waiting to hear the results, and and it was a really awkward time for all of us. However, lo and behold, I got accepted. But a really strange and messy thing happened to me before my acceptance and before my first day at Love in Action, which was that I fell in love with literature. So I remember I was sitting in my room, and I was reading a book called The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And in that book, there's a woman named Hester Prynne who is forced to wear an A on her dress because she has committed adultery. So she has to walk around the town with this A on her at all times. And in the book, it turns out that her interior world was extremely important. In fact, it was the most important part of the book. And her interior world was complex, and it was not black and white, and it was beautiful, and I fell in love with it. And, it was just it felt like someone had just taken the top of my head off and just rearranged all the furniture that had been there for 18 years. And, I felt like I had two brains suddenly. I felt like I had this really messy, literature-based, non-black and white brain, and then I had the God brain that I didn't want to give up. It was this clean, nice version of myself. So on the first day, let me tell you a few things that they did on the first day. So after you sign your name in the ledger, they go through your pockets, your phone, anything that you have that you brought with you to the camp. They look for what's called false images. So a false image is anything that's going to stop you from becoming completely straight. So I'd written a short story in one of my notebooks, and I thought, why wouldn't I bring this short story to the camp? It'll give me something to do when I'm bored, right? It turns out that was a false image. So they ripped the pages out of my notebook, wadded it into a ball, and threw it in a trash can. And in that moment, I began to have the first of many doubts. See, my literature part of my brain was thinking like, that may be a sucky story, but it's my story, and you can't just like rip it out. And then the God part of my brain was like, well, I'm doing this for all the right reasons, and I want to stay with my family. I want to, be a good God-fearing Christian with a nice wife and all that stuff. And so when I went into the group, which was actually composed of people dealing from anything from homosexuality, of course, bestiality, pedophilia, and any other sort of infidelity that anyone had engaged in. And so I'm sitting in this group, it's like a semicircle, and then they asked me to get up and tell my sexual fantasies, basically like anything that I've had, but they said, don't use any language that would make anybody uncomfortable. And so I was like, my brain was like racing, okay, what can I possibly say that won't sound completely inappropriate? And the purpose of this is that you're supposed to air out all of this bad stuff that's been bottled up inside of you and then ask for forgiveness. And the group sort of helps you come to terms with that. And as I began to sort of try to string together some sort of narrative that, most of my experiences had just been looking at underwear ads. And so, like, when I'm trying to explain this, the literature part of my brain is just like, this doesn't make any sense, right? And it wasn't as if faith had always come easy for me. I'd prayed on my knees for, years trying to change myself. But in that moment, I kept thinking of Hester Prynne and how everyone kept telling her that what was happening to her would one day be rewarded in heaven. Okay, so everybody in that town in that book was saying, like, if you just go through all this stuff, you'll be better in the end. And so, days continued, and let me tell you a few of the activities that they had me do. They had me do this thing called a genogram, which, if any of you know psychology, it's like where you put a family tree on a chart, and next to people's names, they wanted me to put things like H for homosexuality, A for adultery, AB for abortion, a $sign for gambling. And this was supposed to represent the Bible verse that says that the sins of the fathers trickle down to the sons, right? So the more sin you have in your family tree, the more likely it is you'll turn out totally gay. That's the logic of the camp. So watch out. And they had me watch sports. This sounds totally fake, but it's very true. They had me watch sports because apparently I hadn't had enough male-to-male contact in my life. And so because I'd missed out on that, I'd somehow started idolizing men's bodies. They had me continually do what's called a moral inventory, which was explain all of the bad thoughts that I ever had in front of the group, attach a Bible verse to it, and feel better about it. So as these weeks passed, I was sort of buying it, sort of not buying it, going back and forth, and it just felt, at some point, like what they were doing to me was the very opposite of love. Remember, their name was Love in Action, and it just didn't feel like that. And I was actually sitting across from an empty chair because I was supposed to imagine my father sitting there. And the counselors were saying, your father has obviously damaged you. This has ruined your life. It's made you who you are, this like sinful person. And they said the more that you can get out about your anger towards your father, the better off you'll be. And I remember sitting there across from that empty chair and that group watching me, and I remember thinking, like, I don't hate my father. Like, he's a really nice person. And yes, he made some mistakes, right? But like, he was always there for me. Anytime I had any problems, he was always available to talk. And what they were telling me just didn't make sense. It was the very definition of absurd to me at that moment. And so, as the counselors were like yelling at me, trying to provoke me to get angry, I just stood up, walked out the door, and I called my mother after they gave me my phone back, and I told her, like, just come here right now, okay? And then she showed up, and the camp counselors came up to the side of the window and said, your son is very rebellious. He's going to have to stay for at least another month, and probably another 3 months after that, and probably a year after that. Like, this is really bad. And, it turns out later, I figured out that that's sort of how they worked things. They kept telling you, you need more work, you need to stay for a month, you need to stay for 3 months, and it's pretty expensive, actually. The 2 weeks that I was there, it was $1,500. Yeah. And so when the counselor was telling my mom that, she said, what is your degree in? Like, what? I know, like, this is the question she should have asked a long time ago, right? But you have to understand, like, this was not in our mentality at the time. We were in crisis mode. And she said, what is your degree in? And he said, marriage counseling. And my mom was like, why are you, a marriage counselor, trying to tell my son how to be straight? This doesn't make sense to me. And something clicked in her as well. Suddenly she realized that what they were doing was totally insane. And so when we got in the car, she drove us off. We were going to think about what was going on, and she said one thing, which was, are you going to kill yourself? Direct again. And I said yes, because because I thought, like, that's the answer that's going to get me out of here. And also, I sort of felt like it at the time. And so she decided at that moment it was much better to have a gay son than a dead one. And so we went back, and, all of that happened, and, I can't tell you every detail of what occurred since then because it's very convoluted. However, I can tell you that it was a total mess, right? My mother and I talked it out. We eventually got on good terms with one another. My father and I talked a little bit about it, but it's pretty buried in the past for us. However, we exchange poetry volumes regularly. Like, I give him poetry and he gives me poetry, which I never thought would happen. And, the ex-gay counselors that tried to turn me straight, for 10 years, I didn't want to think about them. I didn't want to talk to them. I just hated them. And then suddenly I read all these articles about this man, John Smith, who'd run the whole thing, who was apologizing for what he'd done and begging for forgiveness. And in that moment, it tested the very foundation of what I considered to be compassion, because I was just like, there's no way I can forgive this kind of person, And I don't think I fully have, but we are Facebook friends. So, and, it only gets messier, but I feel like it's within the mess that we understand the limitations of our compassion. Without the mess, my mother would have never understood how much she loved me. My father would have never understood how much he had to grow, how much I had to grow. And it's within that mess that we really saw sort of biblical compassion come about. And, I want to kind of extend that into a more general idea, which is that, the world seems really absurd frequently. Like, all you have to do is look at the biggest headlines every day. It seems really absurd, and sometimes it's difficult to even get out of bed. But if there is a God, God made this mess. And we've got to figure out how to make it better, and we've got to figure out how to keep testing the limits of our compassion and keep developing that, because if there is a heaven, nobody cleans their rooms up there. And, I just feel like that's where it is. That's where the mess is. So that's all I've got for you today. But, sorry. Inside this bag, I have, actually, the handbook. And because all of the handbook for the camp, and because all of the slides were really as convoluted as the ideas were, I just will show it to you if you want to come by and look at it and have a little laugh. So does that sound good? Okay, that's it. Thanks. Bye.